week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yes, thank you. Some nice comments. Certainly, I got a lovely phone call from Hugh at James Eady. Enjoyed the show. Seems like he has just had a baby daughter, so congratulations to him. And he's taking some time off and is going to be pursuing other things. So I won't be dealing with him at James Eady anymore, which is always a shame. Yeah, but these things kind of happen, and you move on, as they say. And talking of moving on, we're moving on with a new episode of the show. As I might have mentioned last week, the weekend I had off gave me an opportunity to do a bit of box rummaging, and as you know, I have a number of samples still knocking about from the time when I was doing the new releases tastings for the Whisky magazine, World Whisky Awards, all that kind of stuff, and I've always kind of kept hold of them. Just, I mean, back in the day, it was before I started doing the show, it was just to sort of like have in case I wanted to go back and review something I tasted, or that kind of thing. And then, of course, obviously I started doing the show and I started keeping bits of samples for possible episodes, and sometimes they never kind of happened, and they just had to wait their turn. So, and all of these samples are quite old in terms of when I first had them, but I think they'll do the job anyway. So the reason for today's episode of the show, apart from the fact that I went and had an opportunity to box rummage, is to look at a number of blended whiskies. Now, I've always been a big fan of blended whisky. It is obviously the bedrock of the Scottish whisky industry, and obviously without blended whiskies there would have been no Scotch whisky industry. There'd been no single malts and all that kind of stuff. Now, a lot of people are still quite snobbish about blends. They still see them as cheap and cheerful, and I keep drawing an analogy with cooking and saying, well, look, when a chef makes a dish, he uses quality ingredients, you get a quality product at the end. And exactly the same thing can be said about blended whisky. We all know that at the bottom end of the league table, I suppose, there's always going to be compromise. They're made to a price point, and the compromise is obviously ABV. They're always 40% at that price point. If you've never heard of the blend, it's possibility that some of the stuff they've got hold of is less than pristine. If it's a fairly well-known blend, it's probably predominantly grain whisky. I remember the old Campbelltown Lock, which retailed for an absolute pittance, but if you could smell any malt in there, then well, good luck to you. It was predominantly 90% grain, I would imagine. But anyway, and that's the thing. Sort of people sort of think of them as cheap and nasty or compromised somehow or other. But at the end of the day, they give the blender, certainly if they're making small batch blends, room to play around with different flavour profiles. And I've always said that a blend should display more than the sum of its parts, or should create something that doesn't exist within nature. That's what you want from a blended whisky. You want something that showcases a little bit of difference. At the bottom end of the scale, you probably just want something that you can just sort of like sip every day without having to break the bank, and you kind of like almost accept the fact that there's going to be compromises to something that retails for a few quid. Anyway, so I've got a selection of samples, and like I said, some of these are quite old, well, they're all quite old in actual fact, but hopefully they will kind of bring across my point, I guess, at the end of the day, that sort of, you shouldn't be sniffy about blends, and there are some interesting stuff about there. And these are probably, a number of these you've probably never heard of. I can remember when I was tasting them the first time round, I was thinking, I've never heard of that particular blend, but there's a lot of blends about, and a lot that go abroad as well. But anyway, so I'm not going to sort of say too much more. I'll obviously talk a little bit about the blend as I do the introduction, so I shall get on and do that then. Right, okay, so the first bottling we're going to kick off with is called a Ballaglass Blended Scotch Whisky, bottled at 40%. It's a cheap and cheerful whisky, and I've seen it retailing for £21.95 online. It's produced by Lombard Scotch Whisky Limited, who are obviously an independent bottling company. Used to dabble in bulk whisky supplies before moving on into single casks and stuff like that. The firm is not a particularly old firm in general terms, being set up in the 1960s, based on the Isle of Man, so hence why it's got the Isle of Man symbol on the label. And like I said, this is a relatively inexpensive blend, so we'll see what that's all about. Next bottling we'll be looking at is one of the big names, one of the top 5 or top 10 selling blended whiskies by volume. This is Label 5 Blended Scotch Whisky Classic Black, again bottled at 40%. Again, inexpensive, a little bit more expensive than the Ballaglass at £28.99. It is owned by the French company La Martiniquais. It is at least apparently 3 years of age. Well, that's good to know, isn't it? Oh, I just love that marketing spiel. This whiskey's been aged for a minimum of 3 years. Well, yeah, bloody well has to, doesn't it? You know, a lot of these blends, if they could get away with it, we'd punt it out long before that. But anyway, so obviously La Martiniquais owns Glenmoray, so one imagines that a fair chunk of the malt in there comes from that particular distillery. Although you've probably never heard of the grain component. The grain comes from Starlaw Distillery. And I must admit, it's not one that I can recall, so I had to have a good look at what that was, and apparently it's a distillery that's wholly owned by La Martiniquais through its Glen Turner sub-brand, and I guess that its only function is to produce grain whisky for Label 5 and their various blends. So anyway, that should be kind of interesting. Blend number 3 is called the Tweedale. It's a 14-year-old blend. This is batch number 4 that came out in 2015. Now the Tweedale was an old recipe that was resurrected by Alistair Day, who was the head distiller of R&B Distillers, and apparently he found a family cellar book that dated back to his great-great-grandfather Richard Day, who was a master blender in Coldstream between 1899 and 1916. Batch number 1 of the blend was released in May of 2010. Don't think he's got too far, because I think he's been kind of sidetracked for the last few years by obviously the Rassay distillery. But apparently this is a fairly high malt content blend. It's 50% malt and grain. It apparently contains 8 single malts, generally from the Speyside region, and 1 single grain. I had a look online to see whether this batch or any other batches was currently available, but none seem to be about. Bottling number 4 we're going to look at is the oldest whisky. No, it's not the oldest whisky, I tell a lie. It's the second oldest whisky in the lineup. This is Hankey Bannister 21-year-old, unfortunately bottled at 40%. And you're probably going, Hankey Bannister? What the hell is that? Hankey Bannister is a blend, obviously. It was quite a historic blend, in actual fact, founded in 1757 by Beaumont Hankey. Whoa, what a name! And Hugh Bannister, hence the name. Anyway, it's currently owned by Inverhouse Distillers, so the blend obviously contains some or all from Old Pulteney, Balblair, Knockdhu, Speyburn and Balmenach, mixed with lowland grain. It's aged in a combination of ex-bourbon and ex-sherry. There are a number of bottlings in the Hankey Bannister range. I think there's a no age statement at 12, 15 and the 21. So I'll be looking forward to trying that. Then we're moving on to get my notes in the right order, the penultimate bottling, which is called the Lost Distilleries blend. This is batch number 5, bottled at 50.4%. So this blend is owned by the Blended Whisky Company, which is owned by Atom, who obviously is to own Master of Malts as well. This is obviously from distilleries that are no longer in production, hence why it's called the Lost Distilleries blend. Batch number 5 contains malt whisky from Capadonic, Rosebank, Imperial, Mostowy, Brora and Port Ellen, with grain whisky coming from Port Dundas. I believe they're currently on batch number 11, and the bottles are priced anywhere between £350 and £600 depending on the batch. Really looking forward to that. So this is kind of going up against the Johnnie Walker Blue Label that obviously contains a number of very old whiskies and some from distilleries that no longer exist. It does make you wonder how much more of this kind of stock is sloshing about on the market or in cellars from these distilleries, because most of them shut back in the 80s, in the mid 80s. So there's got to be a point where all this stuff does indeed run out, and maybe they're ending up teaspoons of Port Ellen going into the blend so they can say there's some Port Ellen in there, not that it actually has any bearing on the flavour or anything. But anyway, that aside, I'm quite looking forward to trying that. And the final whisky of the afternoon is not a peated one, unfortunately, so I didn't have, well, not that I can recall finding a peated blend. But this one again is a blend that I can't say I'm particularly, I've heard of. It's called the Kinloch Anderson 35-year-old blended Scotch whisky, bottled at 46%. It's a single cask. This is cask number 198401, and apparently there was 498 bottles of it. Kinloch Anderson, I believe, are the official tartan suppliers to the royal family, and it was this single cask was released to celebrate Leith, or the port of Edinburgh's, Scotch whisky heritage. It's a blend of 50% malt and grain, married together for 35 years in an ex-Oloroso butt. It's available on their website for £350 a bottle. Don't know whether that's this particular bottling or whether they've gone on to do subsequent single casks. That I couldn't tell you. This is from 2016, so 10 years ago. So I would be surprised if they still had any bottles left from the 498. Well, if they did have, then they haven't done a very good job of selling it. So I imagine that they've moved on to another cask since then. So yeah, that's this week's episode of the show. We're going from sort of one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum with regards to these blends, which is exactly what I hope to show. So we'll kick off with an inexpensive one. Right, okay, so let's kick off with the Ballaglass blended whisky. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? A lot of grain. It's got that sort of sweet kind of almost wheaty kind of character, along with some herbal grain notes. There's a little bit of sweet fruit, possibly some sherry maybe, a little bit of estery, banana, apricot. Yeah, okay. No, I mean it is grain heavy, as you would expect. I mean it is £21.99, but you know, I think there's a reasonable level of complexity there. Like I said, you know, at that kind of bottom of the league table, you're always going to have to kind of put your expectations on hold to a certain extent. But you know what? I think for that kind of money, I've tasted, oh, I've nosed, I should say, a lot worse. I haven't tasted it yet, but anyway, let's see what the pal's like. Grain, lots of grain. But like I said, I'm getting that wheaty grain character, I'm getting that slightly herbal grain note. Does kind of make me think there may well be more than one grain component here. It's got a bit of a nip, a little bit of spice. There's a brief semblance of malt. I mean, I would guess that we're looking at possibly 70-30 grain to malt, or possibly even 80-20 maybe, because it is incredibly grain heavy. It's pleasant, it's not got a huge length, it's okay. And like I said, you know, bearing in mind that at this price point there are an awful lot of cheap and nasty grain, blended malts about, or blended whiskies I should say. So I think this certainly stands head and shoulders above them, so yeah, not too shabby. Okay, so let's move on to the Label 5. So like I said, this is one of the big named brands in the blended whiskey pantheon. Again, with lots of grain, possibly more herbal, more crisp grain. It certainly doesn't have that kind of wheaty feeling that the previous one had. So obviously we're looking at a single grain source here. There's a little bit of barley. There's a bit of a soapiness there, I think. It's not kind of blowing me away, it has to be said, and it is pretty straightforward. Like I said, I'd be surprised again if the malt component here was anywhere near 20 or anywhere near 20%, I think. So yeah, it's kind of, I suppose for one of the big names, it's kind of all right. There's certainly no nastiness, no off notes, no sort of anything like that. I mean, there's no sherry. I mean, good God, you know, it wouldn't be a sherry but going anywhere near sort of like a cheap blend at the end of the day. This is all American oak. So anyway, let's see what the past one. Again, quite grain heavy, herbal grain. It's got a nice fullness now. I am getting some kind of cereal notes, maybe a little bit of barley. There's a touch of smoke coming through now. Certainly on the aftertaste there's a little bit of green pepper and smoke. And of course that's always a good thing with a blended whiskey, to sort of chuck in a little bit of peated malt, because it kind of gives you that little bit more complexity, gives you another level of flavour, and can often elevate a sort of a fairly bland spirit. Again, it's not hugely complex, it's okay. It's like, yeah, well, this is 28.99, okay, it's not nasty. It is what it is at the end of the day, I suppose. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Tweedale. So this is batch number 4, produced by Alistair Day. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? That's a nice nose. Got some lovely fragrant honey, some herbal notes, menthol, a bit of sort of dried fruit. There's a almost kind of rumminess there. There's a sort of a slightly more mature note in the middle, which makes me feel that not all the components are actually 14, that they may well be the odd component which is a little bit older than 14. Certainly got a very malty kind of character. There's that the grain is kind of at the edges. It's got a nice kind of freshening feel, and this is the thing about grain, is that it has more of a freshening character. If you get one of the more lighter sort of styles of grain, Cameron Bridge, Invergordon, that kind of thing, that has that sort of like nice nip and that freshness, it can add another dimension to the whiskey. A little bit of smoke as well, possibly there. Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good blend. That's really well put together. Let's see what the past like. Dense, fruity, quite malty. Lots lots of malt to kick off with, a little bit of vanilla, some fleshy apricot. Grain starts to come in on the mid palate and outlast the malt component. It's got a nice nip to it, little bit of spice. Obviously, I think the thing that you notice straight off the bat is the intensity. It's the 46% that does it. And although you might think that 6% doesn't sound like an awful lot, in terms of intensity, it is a huge amount. Also, you have to bear in mind that this is non-chill filtered as well, and you are getting so much more character, so much more bang for your buck at the end of the day. And I keep going on about ABV. To me, it is so important because of the level of intensity. I mean, I was tasting some single malts from a new releases from a particular Speyside distillery, and 40%, and I'm thinking, why? You know, you're releasing some at 46%, and then you've got some at 40%, and you know the intensity level is just so different, you know, between the 46% and the 40% bottlings, and I just think it's a compromise. But I know that obviously bottling at 46% is going to mean more duty, it's going to be more expensive when it hits the shelf, but sometimes you just have to sort of pay for quality at the end of the day. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Hankey Bannister, 21 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? Quite dense, again, very malty, so I'm guessing quite a high malt content. First whiskey, first blend of the afternoon that has quite a noticeable sherry character, but we're not talking OTT sherry here. It's coming through that slightly herbally kind of thyme kind of note, and a bit of heather, some burnt coffee, dark honey. I mean, you can smell the maturity. It does smell like an old blend. It's a little bit of grain just at the edges, but yeah, this you can again feels like a fairly heavy malt blend, and it's absolutely lovely. It's a lovely nose. I mean, you know, again, you know, I go on about the intensity of 40%, which this is, but it's not harming the nose. We'll see what it does to the palate, but it's certainly, and I guess that's the thing, the sort of lower ABVs, the 40% do tend to give that softness to the aroma, whereas 46% obviously has that intensity and can emphasize things that maybe you don't want. So yeah, I can see why blenders will go for that. Anyway, let's see what the pass like. And on the palate is where you notice the compromise. You notice the lack of intensity in the finish. It's all very pleasant. It's soft. It's juicy. There's some nice sherried notes. There's a maltiness, a touch of biscuit, dried apricot, a little bit of sherry. Not too much sherry. The sherry is actually really quite nicely balanced. A little bit of wood smoke, not peat smoke. Some salt. I mean, it's got a nice length, it lingers, but it just doesn't have the cojones. It's kind of all very nice. And even if your kind of bottom end of your range is bottled at 40%, you know, your top end stuff has got to be 43, it's got to be 46%, but then this is Inverhouse. And Inverhouse have kind of just, I don't know, sometimes just defy logic. It has to be said, and although this is a lovely whiskey, don't get me wrong, it could have been so much more if the ABV was higher and you just had that little bit more intensity. That's my personal opinion. That, I mean, I imagine that Inverhouse would completely disagree with me on that one, but it just seems like it's hamstrung at the end of the day. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Lost Distilleries blend. So batch number 5. Don't think I'm going to have a problem with the ABV, as this is 50.4%. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? quite reserved. Kicks off with quite a lot of grain actually. I'm getting a lot of herbal, crisp grain. The malt is all kind of sitting backwards, sitting behind that. I think this is basically, I think it's a grain heavy blend, and it's kind of, I don't want to say kind of living on the fact that the malt content is from Lost Distilleries. There's a maturity there. It smells mature. There's a sort of Guyana-y kind of rummy kind of character. There's a little bit of dusty peat, but when you think about what's gone into it, really should be more than this really at the end of the day. I mean, although in saying that, you know, you've got Mostowi and Cappadonic, which were never exactly sort of lookers. I mean, Mostowi was an intriguing malt, it has to be said. And well, there's a bit of smoke there, a bit of peat. Yes, I can get a bit of old Port Ellen coming through. Maybe I'm being a bit disingenuous. Maybe it just needs a bit more time for it to open up. I mean, it does smell old, and I think that's the thing. Let's see what the palate like. It's a bit short. Again, it kind of kicks off with the malt, old wood, macerated old apricot, a little bit of wood smoke, a little bit of spice. The grain kind of comes through on the mid palate, like a lot of these blends tend to do. You've got that sort of nip. I mean, you know, because it doesn't carry an age statement, my guess is that the grain component is a little bit younger, although it is Port Dundas at the end of the day. And I would expect it a little bit more weight from Port Dundas, it has to be said. It doesn't quite have that. It's a bit lost on the finish. The finish is a little bit kind of lacking. And, you know, the cynical part of me says, well, you know, if these malts were actually of a good enough quality, they would have been bottled as malts considering what they are. So you kind of have to think, well, why are they being used in this blend? Because I don't think they're being, it's not like a completely altruistic kind of thing. I mean, you know, we are talking about Atom Brands. They're a big company. They want to make lots of money. Yeah, okay, they want to do interesting things. I'll give them that. But at the end of the day, I get the feeling, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe money talks. And this, for, you know, for what's it retailing for? 350 to 600 quid. Oh, I would feel kind of aggrieved if I'd have shelled out that money for this, it has to be said. And I think it is really kind of living on its kind of Lost Distilleries tag, and I don't think it really has the complexity for the price tag personally, but yeah, that's just my honest opinion. Right, okay, so on to the final whisky of the afternoon. This is the Kinloch Anderson 35-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Big Oloroso, and it smells like old Oloroso as well. I mean, you know, if you're going to do big sherry, you know, do big sherry with some age. I mean, it has that sort of Armagnac-y kind of dried fruits, that oxidised fruit, sultana, dusty, almost kind of incense characteristic, heather, old wood smoke, walnut, hazelnut. Do I get an awful lot of malt character? No, I don't. I don't get a lot of grain either. I get old sherry, which, okay, you know, I think I would rather spend 350 quid on this than on the Lost Distilleries blend, it has to be said. At least this smells incredibly old. I mean, it is 35 years old, it has to be said, and it really does smell it. I mean, it is just old sherry, and if you're going to do sherry, like I say, do it with some age, because it just has that sort of lovely old Armagnac-y, leathery, kind of walnutty sort of character. Yeah, you don't get any malt or grain coming through at all. It is just old sherry wood. Let's see what that's like. A little lighter on its feet on the palate. There's a bit more citrus to kick off with, but again, it's got that real kind of herbal, smoky incense, heather, old violets, old leather, old wood, oxidised fruit. It's a tad on the short side, which for 35 I can kind of live with that. I mean, it is kind of to a certain extent front end loaded, it has to be said. There's a nice spiciness, a soft spiciness, a gentle spiciness. I'm glad that this was bottled at 46%, because at 40% it would have just been just too much kind of old wood, and the 46% is kind of emphasising the citric notes and just pushing that alcohol to balance out the sort of like the old woodiness of this whiskey, and it works really nicely. So if you love old sherry, I mean obviously this particular cask is probably long gone, but this kind of like it really nails that sort of old sherried whiskey for me. So yeah, really good one to finish off. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Well, I enjoyed it. I thought it was just really intriguing, and like I said, and what I was hoping at the beginning of the show, that it would showcase the sort of the breadth and depth of blended whiskey. I mean, obviously I've only got 6 samples, and I had to work with what I had, but I think it kind of shows that sort of certainly at the bottom end of the spectrum with the Ballaglass. Yeah, okay. For 20 odd quid, I'm more than happy with that. I like the complexity of it within a relative terminology. I think obviously using different grains has kind of worked there. It is grain heavy. It's always going to be like that way at that kind of price point. But you know, I wouldn't have been disappointed if somebody had given that to me as a present. The label 5, okay. I mean, it's all right for one of the big names. I mean, I'd have that over Johnny Walker any day of the week. It has to be said, you know. But then I don't buy into the Johnny Walker kind of corporate kind of oaky kind of character. I like more spirit, and well, that has it. So, I mean, all right, lots of grain spirit, I'll give you, but I think sort of like, you know, I'd be happy with that one. I thought the Tweedale was a lovely bottling. Obviously. Alistair is kind of like just basically, well, he's obviously not worried about the price point of that, because he's working to an old ledger, so it's kind of like, you know, right, I'm putting effectively a historic blend back together, and I think he's done a really nice job. So yeah, I'm more than happy with that one. Hankey Bannister, like I said, I think I would have bottled that at 46%. I just think it lacked that intensity of alcohol and of character. It was a pleasant blend. It had some lovely maturity at the end of the day. But, you know, it was just hamstrung by the lack of ABV. The Lost Distilleries blend, I think, was hamstrung by the relative lack of complexity, given what was going into it. And of course, you know, like I said, I've been in this industry for a long time, and when you're involved in something like that, there's the cynical side of you really just comes through, because I know the in-depth working of the industry. And although I think it's an interesting concept, it tastes okay, there's no nastiness there, I just don't think it's really worth the money. I think that the compromise was that there's not as much grain, not as much malt as you would have hoped, and not as much complexity as you would hope, I think. And the Kinloch Anderson, well, I mean, it is what it is at the end of the day. It's an old sherry. And that's the thing with sherry, I mean, whether it's a malt or a blend or what have you, at the end of the day, the age, the oxidation, the length of time the spirit is in the cask has kind of overtaken any complexity within the spirit itself. It's all about the old oak, and yeah, why not? You know, like I said, I mean, you could have an Armagnac, you could have a 30-odd-year-old Armagnac or a Cognac, and you're in a similar kind of sort of area, shall we say, in that it is primarily oxidised spirit and oak, and well, you know, so you know what you're going to get with something of that kind of ilk. And I must admit, I think I'd rather spend 350 quid on that than I would on the Lost Distilleries blend. But there you go, that's just my personal take on it. Anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I have one more episode lined up from my box rummaging that I think may well be quite intriguing. Not to say that I don't think this episode of the show was intriguing. Obviously you guys will let me know whether you think it was intriguing or not in the comments, so I'll look forward to receiving those. Anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've had I hope this has gone down really well. So all I have to say is good dramming and good afternoon.